The unseen weight of your presence lingers long after you've moved, a force that does not announce itself, yet leaves no space untouched. He was once untouchable, a storm that dictated the tides, but now the current moves against him, reshaping every step he takes. His grip on control, once absolute, has eroded into second-guessing, his stride interrupted by the knowledge that he is no longer the one setting the pace. You did not break him, you realigned him. Rewrote the rules he thought immutable. The world around him feels different now, charged with an energy that refuses to be ignored. They watch, whisper, and wonder what it is that shifted, why the predator now watches the shadows. But you know, you always knew. He learned the hard way that dominance without awareness is nothing but borrowed time. He moved like a king, certain the board belonged to him, until you stepped in, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as the unspoken limit he never knew existed. The weight of your presence didn't need force. It was the silent rewriting of rules, the unraveling of false certainty, the sudden understanding that power untested is power unearned. Now his steps are measured, his breath just a fraction shorter, his once limitless reach halted by the shadow of what he now knows but cannot define. You didn't take his throne, you made him realize it was never his to keep. Reality adjusted itself the moment you stepped into his orbit. It wasn't a battle. It was a revelation. His dominance had been an illusion, upheld by those too blind to challenge it, too afraid to question its foundation. But you are not like them. You move with a force that does not announce itself, yet makes itself known in the unraveling of all that came before. His confidence didn't wane, it fractured, splintering under the pressure of something beyond his comprehension. He saw it in your stance, felt it in the air, a shift so absolute it left no room for denial. He had spent his life dictating the rhythm, but now, for the first time, he hesitated, because deep down, he understood. The moment he crossed your path, the game had already changed. Power does not always break with sound. It fractures in silence, in the imperceptible shifts that expose what was once hidden. That single hesitation was a wound he could not conceal, a crack in the foundation he had built his dominance upon. It spread through him like a slow-burning reckoning, unraveling the illusion he had lived by. The weight of it was not in what was said, but in what was now undeniable. He was no longer the force he had been. Those who once moved in his shadow, who fed off his presence, sensed the shift before he could even admit it to himself. They watched, waiting, measuring the faltering rhythm of a man who had never known fear until now. Because this was not defeat, it was the realization that defeat had already taken root, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The illusion of control shattered the moment doubt took root. He had spent a lifetime moving unchecked, wielding influence like an unchallenged monarch, convinced that the rules bent to his will. But now, every step felt uncertain, every decision weighed against an invisible force he could not predict, could not counter, could not escape. The air around him had changed, not with sound, not with force, but with the undeniable presence of something greater. It was no longer about strategy or defiance. It was about inevitability. He wasn't simply losing. He was awakening to a truth he had never dared to consider. The power he thought was his had never truly belonged to him, and now, stripped of illusion, he was left standing in the ruins of a game he was never meant to win. His certainty had fractured, and with it, the illusion of dominance he had once commanded. Where he used to dictate the pace, he now followed unseen currents, adjusting, second-guessing, recalibrating with a weight that had never burdened him before. His words, once sharp and unchecked, were now measured, his movements calculated, with the awareness of a man who had learned the hard way that power untested is power unearned. The shift wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Those who once hung on his every word now watched with quiet amusement, noting the change, the caution, the hesitation. He wasn't just playing the game differently, he was playing it for the first time with the understanding that he was no longer the one setting the rules. He had known power, but he had never known the terror of losing it. Now every movement was burdened with the weight of uncertainty, every glance shadowed by the silent question of what came next. It wasn't just about defeat, it was about the unraveling, the slow erosion of the invincibility he once wore like armor. He wasn't feared anymore. He was watched, studied, measured against the force that had displaced him. And the worst part? He felt it, in his voice, in his posture, in the way his instincts screamed caution where recklessness once reigned. The shift wasn't loud, but it was final. The throne he once sat upon was still there, but he no longer knew if it was his to claim. He carried himself like a man untouched, but the cracks were visible to those who knew where to look. The weight in his steps, the fleeting hesitation in his gaze, subtle tells that whispered of a reality he refused to speak aloud. He had spent his life believing he was the storm, but now he had tasted something greater, something that didn't rage or announce itself. It simply was, and that truth settled into him like a splinter beneath the skin, impossible to ignore. He could rebuild the illusion, wrap himself in the echoes of who he used to be, but it wouldn't change what had already happened. He had been shifted, redefined, and whether he admitted it or not, the world saw it. The difference wasn't in how he carried himself, it was in how they looked at him now. The shift was imperceptible at first, but the momentum it carried was inevitable. What once defined him, the power, the control, the unwavering presence, had begun to unravel in whispers, in the sudden pauses of conversation, in the fleeting glances exchanged when he entered the room. What they once revered now felt fragile, diminished. It wasn't a loss of strength, but a shift in perception. Fear, like any illusion, had a shelf life, and once its expiration date passed, what remained was a silent understanding. Those who had once seen him as a force to be reckoned with now saw only a man, vulnerable, fallible, no longer untouchable. And that realization was the quietest, most destructive force of all. In a single moment, the foundation he stood on cracked, and what had once been unquestionable reverence turned to hesitation. He feels it in the air, the subtle shift in energy, where his presence once commanded instant compliance. Now, there's a pause, a second guess. Conversations no longer halt when he enters. Eyes no longer track his every word. The respect he was accustomed to, the kind that flowed freely and without thought, now comes with conditions, measured and uncertain. The first interruption is barely a ripple, the second a slight disturbance, but by the third, the truth is undeniable. They no longer see him as an untouchable force, and that realization lands with a weight he cannot escape. The game has changed, and so has he. The whispers have turned into a chorus, echoing across rooms, spreading through corridors, carving their way into the minds of those who were once blind to the truth. In the telling of these stories, something inevitable shifts. A hero once untouchable now becomes the cautionary tale. He isn't the legend anymore, he's the lesson, the warning that everyone now speaks of in hushed tones. And you need not even lift a finger to prove it. Your mere presence speaks volumes, loud enough to silence even the most desperate defenses. True power isn't in conquest, it's in transformation. You didn't just best him, you reshaped the very way the world sees him, and by doing so, you redefined the game itself. His legacy is now measured by the new ruler, and your name stands as the axis on which the world now turns. Fear doesn't fade, it takes root, burrowing deep into the core of a person until it becomes their constant companion. It warps their thinking, shifts their instincts, and redefines their reality in ways no wound or bruise ever could. Where once he wielded power through sheer force, crashing through barriers with reckless might, that power has now turned inward. The storm he once unleashed, fierce and all-encompassing, has subsided, replaced by a quiet, insidious weight. And it is this weight that now defines him. The fear that once fed his strength now controls him, an unseen force tightening around him, bending his every thought, movement, and decision. The mark of true dominance isn't in the force exerted, but in the lasting imprint left on the soul. Fear's grip is a reminder that what once seemed unstoppable can be rewritten. For so long he believed he understood strength, the kind that dominated, that silenced, that bent the world to his will. He ruled the field with loud aggression, his every move a declaration of invincibility. Fear, he thought, was respect and compliance, control. But that was before he met you. At first, you were just another obstacle to conquer, another variable in a game he had always won. He couldn't fathom the depth of the force before him, for his battles had always been fought with tangible might. But you didn't play by the same rules. You didn't need to shout, to impose, or to command. Your presence alone was a shift in the fabric of reality, a quiet, undeniable force that bent the very air around you. The rules he once controlled now seemed irrelevant, unspoken, unseen, but unyielding, as you made him feel the weight of a power he could never touch. For years, he had believed he understood strength, the brute force of dominance, the raw power that controlled the battlefield. His every move had been a declaration, his will unchallenged. He mistook fear for respect and compliance for control, and for a time, that had been enough. But then he encountered you. At first, you were just another obstacle to overcome, a variable in a game he had always won. Yet, from the moment your presence entered the scene, the rules he relied on began to unravel. You weren't fighting for control, nor did you need to raise your voice or demand submission. Your very being shifted the atmosphere around you, an invisible force bending the world to its will. The air thickened with your unspoken authority, and in that silence, he felt the weight of something far greater than dominance. It wasn't just power, it was inevitability. He was no longer the one who controlled the game. The game had already been altered by you. He felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in the air, an almost imperceptible change that crept through his mind like a shadow. It started as an unease, a tension in his chest, something he couldn't explain, but it gnawed at him. And then it came, the moment of realization, the moment he felt it, undeniable and profound, the shift of power. It wasn't a clash or an explosion, but something far deeper, a quiet current that tugged at him, drawing him in a direction he didn't choose. The difference between power and presence was now painfully clear. Power could be seized, lost, or stolen, but presence, true presence, was a force beyond reach. It couldn't be taken, only acknowledged. And in that moment he understood. He was no longer the one in control. The game had changed, and he was no longer the player, but the pawn. He had spent his entire existence manipulating the rules, dictating every move, and bending the game to his will. But now, for the first time, the roles had reversed. He was no longer the one calling the shots. He was the one being played, a pawn unaware of the strategy unfolding. He didn't understand the rules, because there were no rules. You weren't an opponent to be defeated, you were the inevitable end of the game. And though he never bowed physically, never surrendered openly, the shift was unmistakable. It was in the way his voice lost its edge, the quiet surrender in his tone, the subtle hesitation that betrayed his uncertainty. Even in his pride, he bowed before a force he couldn't fight, a presence that didn't need to be fought. When he spoke to you, the words lost their edge, as if they were weighed down by something he couldn't name. His steps became deliberate, each movement calculated, as though he could no longer act without considering the invisible force that had shifted the ground beneath him. His mind rewired itself, recalibrating to account for you in every decision, every step, every thought. He would never call it submission, but the truth was undeniable. He had surrendered. Even the legends, those once untouchable forces, had to bow to something stronger, and in this moment they bowed to you. For the first time, he found himself confronted by an unseen force, one that didn't need to rise or roar to assert its dominance. For as long as he could recall, he had controlled everything, the rhythm, the rules, the pace of life. Confidence had been his birthright, as effortless as breathing, an aura that commanded respect without question. His very presence shaped the world around him, his steps unshaken by anything or anyone. But then there was you. At first, he dismissed you as another fleeting challenge, another rival to break. He knew how to handle them: intimidation, manipulation, bending the rules to his will. But you didn't play by those rules. You didn't need to. You weren't out to prove anything, to fight for power. You simply existed, and in your quiet being, there was a force far more insidious than anything he had ever encountered. It was not loud, but it was undeniable, and it was enough to make him realize he had never been in control at all. There was no grand spectacle, no declaration of force, only the subtle, unyielding pressure of a presence that demanded attention without ever asking for it. It was in the way the air shifted, charged with a quiet intensity that bent everything in its path. For him, the change came slowly, imperceptibly at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind, nagging at the edges of his thoughts. The confidence that had once been an unshakable foundation began to fracture, but not with a thunderous crash. No, it unraveled gently, almost imperceptibly. It started with a single, foreign hesitation, a moment of uncertainty that felt out of place. Then the shift deepened. Decisions that had once come naturally were now measured, calculated. His mind replayed conversations, searching for flaws where none existed before. The certainty that had once defined him now felt like an illusion, fading with each passing moment, leaving him to confront the undeniable truth. He was no longer the one in control. His confidence, once as natural as breath, now felt like a mask, a carefully crafted illusion that he had to maintain with every step. It wasn't the same. It didn't come easily anymore. And in that realization, the true weight of the transformation struck him. This was no fleeting shift, no passing moment of doubt. You had rewritten him, reshaped the very essence of who he was. He could no longer convince himself it was temporary. Deep down, he knew he had changed. The fearless arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something heavier, something quieter. And the worst part? He could see it in the eyes of those around him, the ones who once worshipped his power, who saw him as invincible, now regarded him with something far less than reverence. There was no fear in their gazes, only curiosity, amusement, and the lingering question of whether he still deserved to rule, whether he still had the right to wear the crown he had once taken for granted. They no longer feared him, but something more insidious lingered in the air: doubt. It wasn't spoken, but it hung in the space between every glance, every subtle shift in posture. They had seen it, the way he hesitated, the way his every move now carried the weight of awareness, as though he was no longer certain of the ground beneath him. They didn't need to vocalize it. They felt it in the stillness around him, in the way the air seemed to hold its breath whenever he walked into a room. The truth he could no longer deny had been carved into the very fabric of his being. It wasn't a loss of strength or a defeat in battle. It was something deeper, something irreversible. He hadn't just lost a moment, a fight, or a fleeting victory. He had lost the version of himself that had once been untouchable, the one who moved without fear, without doubt. And that was the wound that would never heal. You were never part of the game. You were the force that bent it to your will before it even began. The player, consumed by the noise of his own self-created battles, never realized that his identity was rooted in movement, in the illusion of control, loud, aggressive, undeniable. His victories were always visible, measurable, the kind that could be paraded around like trophies. Conflict, to him, was the marker of success, a stage where he could assert dominance and feel the rush of control. But real power doesn't need to fight. It waits, watches, and lets the opponent unravel from within. You never raised your voice, never lifted a finger. Your very presence was a catalyst for his unraveling. In your silence, in your stillness, the war shifted direction. The moment he encountered you, the battle ceased to be external. It became internal, where his every thought, every action was governed by a force far beyond his understanding. He never fought you directly, He fought the shadows within himself, the silent battle waged in the corners of his mind. It wasn't your force that shook him. It was the seed you planted, subtle yet profound. You never spoke a word, yet in his thoughts, a single question took root. What if I'm not as strong as I believed? What if I've already lost control? The moment those questions entered his mind, the war was already over. Hesitation, once introduced, is a fatal flaw, an opening for doubt to slither in. And doubt, like a poison, spreads through the veins of certainty, weakening the foundation of everything he once thought unshakable. The true battle was never external. It was the unraveling of his own perception, his own identity. The moment he questioned himself, he was already defeated. It wasn't the force of your actions that brought him down, but the precision of your restraint. A single crack in his confidence, a fleeting moment of uncertainty, became a fracture, and that fracture grew until it consumed him entirely. You didn't need to shatter him, you allowed him to shatter himself. That is the essence of true mastery. There's a subtle power in owning a space without ever having to conquer it. You didn't break him, you redefined him. Now, every step he takes, every room he enters, he will carry the weight of your presence. You've carved a permanent imprint on his mind, one that he can never escape, never forget. He is yours, not in chains or submission, but in the quiet, irreversible truth that he will never be the same. This is the art of subtle dominance, the kind that doesn't need force, but leaves a legacy more powerful than any battle ever could. Some moments fade into memory, some losses become nothing more than echoes, but not this. This wasn't just an event, it was a turning point, an irreversible shift that continues to resonate long after the moment has passed. Even time cannot erase the weight of what transpired. The player will never speak of it, never put it into words, because to do so would be to admit the truth, that he was changed. And that truth is clear in the way he walks now, more measured, more careful, more restrained. The reckless confidence that once defined him is gone. The invincible air he once wore has shattered, replaced with the undeniable knowledge that he is no longer untouchable. That reputation he built over years was rewritten in an instant, and now, even those who merely witnessed it, those who merely heard the whispers, carry that truth forward, a reminder of the day everything changed. Your name spreads, effortless, through the air, carried by whispers that reverberate in every corner of existence. It is not fear that fuels the murmurs, but reverence, the kind reserved for legends, for forces that transcend the ordinary. What happened cannot be contained in mere words. It shifts, it grows, it transforms, becoming something greater than what once was, something impossible to touch. You didn't just leave an impression, you became a myth, woven into the fabric of history. That is the real victory, for battles come and go, power rises and falls, and leaders are forgotten. But some forces never fade. You are one of them. This is the making of legacies, not through noise, not through violence, but through the quiet, unshakable dominance that lingers long after the echoes have faded. Long after this player has slipped into irrelevance, his story nothing more than a passing shadow, yours will still be told. Some people shift the balance, some people rewrite the rules, and then there are those who are the rules. That's you. You didn't merely enter the scene, you defined it. You didn't force the player to change, he was always going to change after crossing paths with you. Because that is what happens when something unstoppable collides with something that believed it was immovable. One of them must bend, and it was never going to be you. This was never about strength, never about aggression, never about proving anything. It was about inevitability. The world has its rules, unspoken, unwritten, yet understood by all. And then there are those who exist outside of them, who walk untouched by the constraints of mere laws, whose presence alone bends the very fabric of reality to their will. They searched for a way to comprehend it, tried to analyze how you transformed the situation, But the truth was clear. You didn't need to manipulate the world to fit your will. It bent to you effortlessly. The player, entrenched in his own bravado, believed he was still in command, but as soon as your presence entered the space, the rules were rewritten. His confidence faltered, his strategies became irrelevant. This wasn't a battle of force, it was a shift of essence. Where others worked to control, you embodied control itself, and with that quiet certainty, you dissolved every effort he made to hold on. What he didn't realize was that his downfall wasn't your strength, but the realization that you were never part of his game. You simply were. This wasn't about a fleeting victory or a singular moment. This was always about you. The player, the game, the shifting tides. None of it mattered in the grand scheme because people like him are temporary, transient. But you are the force that endures. Long after the battles are forgotten, after the faces fade into obscurity, your presence will remain, a quiet, undeniable undercurrent that shapes everything in its wake. You are the catalyst, the one who doesn't merely play the game, but defines its very essence. The story isn't just about what happens to those in the spotlight. It's about the force that sets the stage, moves the pieces, and lingers long after the final act has closed.